we're here with Lynn Landis from Landis Report, and Lynn will be sharing with us today on the transparent vote count. This is her expertise, among others. Lynn, you want to just start into it, and we'll see where. How did you get in? Let me ask. How did you get first involved in that?
It was actually in the early 1990s. I was a Democratic committee person in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Okay. And a fellow committee person, Rebecca Mercury, approached me and we were discussing the problem with the counties considering the purchase of electronic touchscreen voting machines. And at the time we had lever voting machines.
Oh yeah, we had that in Connecticut. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, she was a computer scientist,
Okay.
and she was collaborating with other computer scientists across the country to raise the alarm about this issue. Later on in 1995, I actually ran for office, for local office, on the lever voting machines. And during that whole period of the 1990s, I was very active in environmental and health issues. I started a website called Zero Waste America. I wrote several articles, agitated in favor of recycling and not polluting and that sort of thing. But in 2000, with the 2000 election and how that started to implode, I had lost track of what Rebecca had, was up to. And there I saw her name on the front cover of the Philadelphia Inquirer. And she had gotten her PhD in computer voting security, and became actually the expert witness for for the Gore side of Bush v. Gore of the lawsuit. So I became more interested. I had a radio show. I interviewed her. I was on Drexel University Cable TV, and we did more interviews on that subject. And I gradually started to do research and write articles. And in fact, it was the second article I wrote called Elections in America Assumed Crooks Are in Control, that Bev Harris of Black Box Voting read. And that got her interested. So, it was a series of people getting other people interested in the subject. Now, Rebecca, Dr. Mercury, had focused in on the, she considered the science part of it. As far as electronic voting machines, and her thought at the time was, well, if we're going to use these, they should produce a paper receipt, something that the voter can check and then put in a box, and that sort of thing. And at first I sort of bought into that, thinking, well, that makes sense. But after a while, and after I started to look at the issue in a broader perspective, I came to realize that really technology has really no place in the voting booth, and that we really needed to go back to paper ballots and hand counts at the polls. So, in the course of the last several years, I've written many articles about it, and gone to conventions. I have another couple websites. One is called counttheballots.org, and the other one is called thelandisreport.com, where there's a lot of information I have on the importance of this issue. I should also mention that I got my Bachelor of Arts degree in political science from Temple University back in 1976. And they really don't teach you a whole lot about the practical side of politics, and certainly nothing about real voting. So when I started to research this, I finally began to see the big picture. And that is that in this country, we've never really had an effective vote. There has always been a strong ability by the elite or the wealthy to control election outcomes. Initially, in this country, of course, as we all know, white men with property were the first to vote, and then eventually most white men, with some exceptions, by the Civil War. But during and after the Civil War, things began to change as it became clear minorities, blacks, and eventually women were going to get the right to vote. And three very definite things happened. One, in the 1870s, absentee voting began to be allowed. And they started it out like they are for internet voting now, is with the military. It only applied to the military. That's what got their foot in the door.
There's also, when did they go from transparent to secret
That was the
ballot.
next thing
Yeah.
they did. That
Yeah.
was in the 1880s. The secret ballots started in Australia in about
Bad precedent.
right.
Yeah.
It really, because what we do with our secret ballot, although it may have some advantages in terms of you might make a more independent decision if it's done secretly. It's less of a groupthink kind of thing. You've really handed your election officials a blank, anonymous ballot. That frankly, an unscrupulous election official can do
Right,
just about anything
right.
they want with that.
Yes.
And it also, the secret ballot makes recounts and audits, not that important.
Right,
That
right.
doesn't legitimize an election. So, and then the third thing that happened in the 1890s, so we've got the 1870s absentee voting, 1880s the secret ballot, 1890s voting machines were introduced. So now all bets are off
Wow.
as far as
Yep.
any transparency
Yep.
to American elections. By the 1930s, most urban areas, major urban areas, had voting machines. Now in 1964, there was a quantum leap towards non-transparency with the introduction of ballot scanners, computerized ballot scanners. That was in 1964. And it's so cynical in a way, that move, because in 1964, we have the Civil Rights Act. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act. Just as they were making it more possible superficially for African Americans to get the right to vote, at the very same time, they were consolidating the control of the vote count in the hands of a few corporations.
Well, then it became the networks were just start from the 50s and the 60s were that era too, with them broadcasting the vote like quickly. And I mean, before that, it took quite a long time.
Well,
before
almost at the exact same time, in 1964, the exit polls began to be used. So 64 is the date
Yep.
for computerized vote counting, and for these exit polls that they also claimed were computerized, so that the major news networks kept their control over the exit poll, and there was only one, not several, only one that they controlled. They kept that a big secret. And it wasn't just the news networks, but it was also the Associated Press, and it was also the Washington Post, and I believe it was the New York Times was the other newspaper involved at the time. Today it's the major news networks, the cable news networks, and still the Associated Press. And the Associated Press, what they do is they are the sort of the bag man, as it were. It's their employees that are busy on election night and before processing the data they get. And they use
but there's a central tabulation, and there's no oversight in that.
Well, they're tabulating it in their own way. They also, I want to also
There's
add,
oversight in that. And
there is no oversight. There's no oversight to
check
the
and balance
Associated
on that.
Press at all.
As a matter of fact, I
yeah.
want to tell you about what happened in New Hampshire this year. And the Republican recount I was up there for, Albert Howard, black Republican candidate, I was up there, and he wanted me to come and film this at the Secretary of State's office. Well, what happened was, he said, "Walter, could you come over? I need some help here." I mean, the Secretary of State was supposed to make a public announcement that they were going to start the recount. The Democratic recount was already finished, and he was stalling on this. So I get over there, we're filming, saying, well, let's make the AP's downstairs. Let's go downstairs and film it, or announce it. And he kept stalling, and he begrudged. I mean, he didn't want to go. we got insisted, let's go. We bring him downstairs. He goes up to the AP room, and they looked at him, the guy in charge there, like, what the heck are you doing here? And he's like, you could see who the power was there. The body line, and he's telling the Secretary of State what to do. He says, well, I had to come down. Here's a candidate right here, and he wants the recount. And he says, look, this is what you need to do this. Call so-and-so tomorrow. And they're whispering. I couldn't get close enough without them cutting this off. But he's telling the secretary, the AP was in charge of this.
Well,
and
that's
telling them-
interesting.
yeah.
Because
and the
he-
other interesting
right.
thing I found out with this whole, I was up there for a whole month with Bev Harris and Vicky Karp from Texas. We all
Right,
pulled our
right.
sources together. And the other thing I found out was interesting was that the town clerks are on the payroll at AP. They're calling in the votes, but that's not right.
Well, actually, Christopher Bolin, who's a reporter, he's a freelance
mean, they
reporter right
admitted
now.
it. Yeah.
He was in Cook County, Illinois, where the AP had dedicated lines from the main vote tabulating computer
Yeah.
to their
Yeah,
computer.
they adjust it whatever way they want.
Well, the thing about the Associated Press is people think of them as just like a union of newspapers, but that's not the case at all. The Associated Press is a not-for-profit, but they seem to be making about.
Who's a major stockholder of the?
Well, when I
Yeah.
did my own research, there were several people listed, and they owned shares. But some of the research I'm finding on the internet these researchers are saying not only does the Rothschild Incorporated own
that's what I
Reuters
found,
since
too.
the 1800s, but Reuters bought the Associated Press, according to their research,
Yeah.
back in around 93. So here you have the Rothschilds, who also had, at
I
one
found
point...
the same thing on their own site. The Rothschild, that was on Rothschild's site, major stockholder in the AP. So this is really interesting with the Rothschild International Banking Cartel.
That's on the board of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
But beyond
Then
that...
they control the vote, or
they-
the major stock in that?
Well, they had, when
County?
I did research on ES&S, the largest voting machine company that controls, I'd say, about 35% of the electronic vote, they had an investment. It was Rothschild Realty had an investment in ES&S, along with the Hunt brothers and all kinds of others. So and that has not been my forte. To Bev Harris of Black Box Voting is great at that kind of research, but somebody should do more of it, because both Diebold and ES&S, they together control 80% of all ballots being counted in the United States, because they control not only the touchscreen voting machines, but they also control the computerized ballot scanners. That's what a lot of people are making a distinction between touchscreen machines and ballot scanners. But to be frank, it's both a computerized count. And if you're going to rely on a recount or an audit after the fact, you're in deep trouble.
Weeks later.
Right,
I mean,
because we're finding that by that time, you have 50 states with 50 secretaries of state, or in the case of some states, it might be the attorney general, who are in charge of the vote, the voting system.
Yeah.
And if I wanted to control a country, I would control the vote count through those people. And in fact, when you look at the Congress, you're talking about your clients. Let's say if you want to control a vote count, you got 500 plus 550 congressional seats you have to worry about. You've got 3,300 counties, and in the case of Philadelphia, several congressmen come from one county. So you can control who's in Congress. Worse yet, with the control of the voting, the electronic vote count, for those states that have initiatives and referendum, you're in real trouble, because they don't even have to control the people who are the elected officials. They can control what gets passed, by this what they call direct democracy. That is particularly vulnerable to the influence of this computerized voting.
Right.
And one other thing I wanted to mention is this is not limited to politics. It also influences all these other elections that unions and the Florida Bar and all these other civic organizations are having over the internet. Whenever you have a secret ballot, whether it's electronic or paper, you're in big trouble, because you are allowing someone to, control who represents us in civic and political life.
it was the first time I really started to get some understanding of the caucus thing. But the more I'm open to that, it seems that's very transparent. It's right out in the open, show of hands, or they move to the side.
Well,
That's a very transparent way, and
I think that is a better method, because even if you had paper ballots and hand
it could
counts,
still be.
if you don't have
some-
everyone in the room at the same time, like in Philadelphia, they had I was at the city commissioners meeting where a young Republican gentleman complained that even with the court order, they couldn't get poll watchers into the precincts. The precinct, the judge of elections simply refused to allow them in. But if it's more of an open voting situation, with all eyes on what everyone's doing at the same time, it's far more transparent.
Right.
But another thing I wanted to mention is a lot of people, there have been a lot of movies and documentaries done on these past elections, and you could almost leave the theater thinking we need to get more machines, and because the emphasis has been on long lines and convenience, and instead of trying to make the elections more transparent and legitimate, we're a lot of voters want to do this early voting.
Right, this absentee.
Yeah, early and absentee voting.
Bad idea.
Right. I mean, now if you.
Where does it go? I mean, how do you there's no transparency then.
Absolutely not.
I don't know whether it ends up in the dumpster in the back.
Right.
Or not.
There's no way to stop an election official from just dumping it.
Yeah.
But if you want to have more than one election day, let's say you want to do that, then you would have to have that day, that tally being taken, not sitting around in an office to be counted at some future date. And therein lies another issue, and that is for all these other countries, most other countries around the world do paper ballots and hand counts.
Yeah.
But a lot of them do not count at the polling precinct. England does not count at the polling precinct. They gather all these ballots together and cart them off to what's called a central counting facility. And that's where the ballots get counted. And that's a huge mistake.
Yeah. It's like what Jim Collier did down when they followed the votes. And they had all that documented fraud going on at that one central punching holes in the Chads, They had well, you saw the clip, haven't you?
Right. And in Afghanistan.
Actually, that was our first show with Jim Collier, and he had that. He's passed on since, but he had at the time was that original tape that from the 70s that he had filmed, he and his brother Ken.
Well, those of us who, I followed in the footsteps of the Colliers. As a matter of fact, I repeated a lot of their interviews. I called the Associated Press and called Matovsky to find out what the heck was going on, and I got the same door shut in my face, completely non-transparent about what they were doing. But some of the other things that people should be aware of as far as this voting issue is concerned is that the very organizations like the NAACP and ACLU and all these, and many of them are related to academia that purport to be there to fight for our right to vote are either missing in action completely or actually actively working against a transparent voting process. And even to include some people like Ralph Nader. I mean, you can go on his website. He's really, not taking a strong position on this issue. So it's very problematic. It's really the kind of issue that people on the streets, have to take as their own. They can't sit back and rely on the Democrats, and certainly not the Republicans, to help out. And again, the Democrats themselves, they put forward legislation to have a paper trail to these electronic voting machines when we know machines themselves cause so much chaos and confusion. They have no business being there. So the question is, what can we do about that? I have a few suggestions. My primary suggestion is that people form what I would call parallel elections or citizen audits. Some people combine that and call it Citizen Audit Parallel Election Report, otherwise known as CAPER.
Okay.
And I wrote an article about this back in 2005. And in fact, crazy as it may seem, people really took me up on it. And what they did was they set up like a card table and I've done this myself at a poll, a precinct on election day. And then they've asked people to tell them who they voted for and sign, saying, in other words, you're basically collecting
An affidavit. Right.
And based on that, we can have more of an idea, not the best idea, but a better idea.
I did that in Iowa straw poll. We had Vote and Sunshine Project was out there. There were about 1,200 votes 14,000 that showed up or cast that day. And they had 60 Diebold machines, and we wanted to get rid of it, the machines, and bring in just hand count. They wouldn't do it. So we set up affidavits. There were 4 exits. We had only less than a dozen of us, 8 of us maybe, and we watched all the exit polls. And what we did was we asked people who they voted for, and we witnessed it and signed it. And we also had some affidavits, sworn affidavits with notaries, but these were sworn affidavits. And we found that about 98% of the people didn't mind sharing who they voted for.
Clint Curtis was a programmer for a company called Yang, and they had hired Tom Feeney as a lobbyist, and Tom Feeney was the Speaker of the Florida House. And he wanted Yang, through Clint Curtis, to come up with a program that would basically flip an election.
Right.
Clint thought it was like a joke, that they were just trying to see how easily it could be done so they could catch the Democrats. He was kind of admittedly naive about what Feeney was really up to. But when he got the message from his employer, no, this is serious, we want you to flip this election.
He was a programmer.
Yes,
programmer,
right. Clint Curtis quit, and he went public with it eventually. And eventually he ran against Tom Feeney, and realizing that the election could be flipped on him, he decided that he was going to conduct a citizen audit on Election Day. The mistake he made, though, was he let the people at those selected precincts know he was going to do it. So just to set this up a little bit, John Zogby of Zogby International, internationally known polling company, they did a pre-election poll. Clint Curtis did his own pre-election poll. Now, these polls showed Clint Curtis and Tom Feeney being neck and neck. And on Election Day, on those polling precincts where Clint had his audit in place, the audit results matched the official results. No problem there. Except Clint Curtis lost by 16 percentage points. So, he realized after the fact his mistake. He should have never let him know where he was going to do these audits. So he had to go back, select 10 more precincts, and took the next 6 months.
Oh, they told him where he was going to do that.
Well, he told the public. I mean, they knew where he was going to do these audits on Election Day.
So
when those
10%.
in those precincts, nothing looked untoward.
Sure.
So, but he still lost by 16 percentage points. So he realized his mistake. He went back, selected 10 more precincts, and he and his volunteers went door to door collecting affidavits, and found that instead of losing, the disparity between the official results and his audit results, and he was getting an enormous participation rate, was between 12 to 24%. In other words, that election wasn't stolen by a little bit. It was stolen by a great big whopping chunk.
He was ahead 12?
The disparity. So he figures based on the information, the data he collected, that he would have won.
Oh yeah.
But not by a whole whopping amount. But the disparity between the 16 percentage points of what he was supposedly lost by,
right.
That wouldn't have been the case.
Wow.
And this is what happens: is people think, and candidates think, that if they lose by a lot, well, there's no point. We lost by so much, but that's the genius of stealing by a whole lot, is that you emotionally depress the other side, so they never think that anybody would steal by that much. But with these electronic voting machines,
there's no way you can tell.
And anonymous ballots, there's no way you can tell.
No.
So what Clint Curtis did after he collected all this information, this was, he ran in the 2006 congressional races. So as a result of that, the Democrats did gain control of the House. And there was a the House Administration Committee at that point was the chair of that committee was Congressman Brady, my congressman. He took over from another congresswoman who was, I think, more sympathetic to the cause, but she died. And so Brady took over, and there was Clint Curtis and about 4 other Democrats who were contesting their election, saying there's something wrong going on here. One of them was Christine Jennings, where 18,000 votes, 18,000 voters apparently did not vote for her office. It's what's called an undercount. It looks very suspicious.
Right.
So he goes to this House Administration Committee, and the only election they decided to investigate was Christine Jennings, where there's probably no evidence left, and where Clint Curtis bothered to get real evidence, they voted unanimously not to investigate. So therein lies the problem. So what we're dealing with is the court of public opinion in order to chip away at this problem. The other problem, of course, that those of us very involved in this have encountered is the fact that the Department of Justice, they had this election integrity department. That's a department that would normally investigate these kinds of problems. But that's been that's been headed by Craig Donsanto since 1970. And he's had absolutely no interest in investigating anything to do with electronic vote fraud.
Well, I know back with Jim Collier, I mean, he brought it to the Attorney General at the time, who was State's Attorney General in Florida.
Yeah, in Florida, right.
Who happened to be Janet Reno at the time, and she covered it up. They brought it up to the Justice Department, covered it up, and it's been going on ever since.
Right.
What we're hoping to do, we're making that one of our issues, the committees of safety, and we're going to do it through community public awareness and get these statutes passed that will get rid of these machines, because you're absolutely right, Lynn. I think we have to get rid of these machines. Transparent, paper ballots, hand counted, public view, posted in public.
Yeah, and I think also the national networks should have no business in these exit poll operations.
No.
If you think about it, it's a conflict of interest.
No,
they're creating the news and then they're reporting
it. They get it all from that AP to anyway centralized.
Well, the Colliers,
anyway.
The Colliers found direct evidence that the news networks, through the Associated Press and this exit poll, were basically shoring up or covering for rigged election results. And that's why they don't ever want to talk about this issue, because they're complicit. It's not like they're asleep.
No.
They're not asleep. They're wide awake.
They are complicit
Yes,
in this.
extremely.
And that's stealing one of our most precious assets, is our vote. And we're supposed to be exporting democracy. I mean, they're more honest in Zimbabwe elections, I think, than here.
Well, when you're looking at elections, always check every aspect of that election, and if they're not counting the ballots in the place where the people voted, then all bets are off.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid a lot of countries around the world, they bought into the secret ballot, and they're buying into the central counting facility. So it's those two things.
Well, Lynn, thank you, and I'm glad you're here at the Boston Tea Party weekend, and looking forward to hearing you tomorrow.
Thank you for inviting me.